Greetings all my true believers, this is Dante D bringing you another video, and today we're going to be talking about 90s comics. Finally, for so long I've been saying that I've been wanting to make a video specifically dedicated to the best 90s comics and the 90s comic book crash. I have to thank Levi Roseland though, who was watching one of my videos a few days ago and left a comment reminding me to do this video. So Levi, if you're watching, thank you for reminding me to do this. Now before we get into today's video, I just kind of wanted to reach out to you, the viewers, and thank you all for watching and commenting. I've really enjoyed responding to all your comments and starting some really great conversations here. All of the support and the feedback has been great, and even the criticism has been really respectful and constructive, and I've really tried to incorporate all of the constructive feedback that you've all provided into my videos to make them better. So thank you all once again, and I look forward to receiving more of your comments and starting even more great conversations. Today's video is going to be divided into two segments. We're first going to start off with a discussion of the 90s comic book crash and the factors that ultimately led up to that crash. We're then going to move on and talk about the top 10 comic books of the 90s. For this list, we are not looking at story value, art value, or even the monetary value of these comic books. To have made it in this video here today, these comic books had to have made one heck of a cultural impact in the 1990s. So let's get into it. I apologize in advance if this video is a little longer, but I just didn't want to leave out any details because the 1990s was a very, very complex era in comic book history. Now, for those of you that are new to comic book collecting, you're going to find that whenever the 90s is mentioned, it's usually followed by a cringe. The 90s has really kind of become a dirty word in the world of comic book collecting. And that's mainly due in part to the fact that a lot of stereotypes about the 90s and comic books have developed over the years. First stereotype is that comic books from the 1990s are worthless. And more often than not, they are worthless. Collectors, quite simply, usually do not collect comic books from the 1990s. And when people try to get rid of their comic books from the 1990s, they often have a very hard time getting rid of them. And if they do manage to get rid of them, it's usually for a ridiculously low price. The stories from the 1990s are often seen as very stupid and unnecessarily violent, and the art is also seen as over the top. But again, these are all stereotypes. Like any era, there are good comic books and bad comic books. I just think in the 90s there just happens to be more bad comic books, but that doesn't mean that you have to completely write off the 90s. In my opinion, I think the 90s were great. I love 90s. I love 90s comic books. And there are a lot of stories from the 1990s that I absolutely love and am so happy to have in my collection. I really think it's pop cultural laziness to just write off the 90s as crap, because the 90s was a very polarizing era in comics. It was very, very controversial, but very eventful and very interesting. So without further ado, let's get into the actual factors and examine these factors that led up to the perfect storm that is 1990s comics. So let's start off by briefly summarizing all of the factors that I believe ultimately led up to the comic book crash of the 1990s. And those are nostalgia and the collecting of comics, the release of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, and that kind of shift to darker stories, the comics direct market, the rise of the rockstar artist, and comic book speculation. Nostalgia and the collecting of comic books. What I really kind of wanted to highlight here is the fact that before 1970, generally nobody really collected comic books. Comic books were really seen as a disposable, worthless children's waste. The first thing that mom always wanted to get rid of when cleaning out the house was those damn comic books, right? Nobody from the golden age of comics, and even to a certain extent the silver age of comics, kept their comic books. They bought them at a grocery store or a drugstore or something. They read them, they rolled them up, stuck them in their pocket, they traded them, and then after a while they ended up in the garbage, or their dog ate it, or they were ripping it and spitting their gum out in it. They just generally weren't kept. But what was happening was by the 1970s, all of those people who were children in the late 1930s and 40s and 50s, they were all adults now. They were starting to feel nostalgic for these stories and these comic books that they read from in the 1930s. And what was happening was a lot of these people were going back to try to find that comic that they had when they were a kid, or that first comic book that they had, just to kind of keep it for sentimental value. You really could see that this was the case in the early 1970s, because before the 1970s, in the Silver Age and in the Golden Age comic books, you never really saw any ads advertising back issues. From the 1970s and up, that is when you really started seeing the appearance of ads in comic books that were advertising the sale of back issues from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, so on and so forth. I really think that Marvel Comics also had played a role in the start of the back issue market. So how was Marvel responsible for the back issue market partially, you may ask? Well, I really think that has to do in part with the fact that there exists a complex entity called the Marvel Universe. Back in 1961, when Marvel Comics first released Fantastic Four #1, that was it. Marvel Comics would never be the same. That was the birth of the Marvel Universe. And from 1961 all the way to present day, it's been the same Marvel Universe. Comic books today are referencing certain storylines and things that happened in comics back in the 60s and in the 70s. It's just such a complex universe. All of their line of titles took place in the same universe. Characters from one title started appearing in another title, and it just became such an intertwined and complex entity that it really was becoming a little hard to keep track of everything that was going on. So all the new readers in the 1970s wanted to find out what was informing the stories that they were reading at the time. They wanted to go back and find out about their favorite characters' origins. They wanted to go and find issues that dealt with a guest character in the weekly comic that they read. They were just trying to piece together the giant puzzle that was the Marvel Universe. Like I said, it was what Marvel did with their universe was unprecedented. I mean, DC did it to a certain extent in the 50s and 60s with the Batman Superman crossover, but what DC did was nothing compared to what Marvel did starting in 1961. So that is what likely and very quietly started the whole hobby of collecting comic books. Let's fast forward from the 1970s all the way to 1986. And 1986 was a watershed year in comic books. Why, would you ask? Well, that was the year that saw the release of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, which were hugely, hugely successful, not only amongst comic book fans, but even in the general population, people that either had never read comic books before, and also people that had been away from comic books for such a long time. These stories reimagined classic characters and classic ideas of superhero comics and made them a lot more mature and complex and darker. With the immense success of Dark Knight Returns and The Watchmen, it would only be a matter of time before DC would examine those themes a little bit more, and other companies would try to capitalize on the use of darker, more mature themes in their books as well. From 1986 on, you saw a brand new trend in comics, as EC Comics used in the 1950s, but there really was a brand new trend in comics from 1986 forward, and that was the use of darker, more mature themes. But I think that publishers really kind of missed the point, and they were just superficially using violence and sex and mature themes to sell books, but they weren't looking at what Frank Miller and Alan Moore were really trying to accomplish with their books. Stories became more violent. Stories became sexier. Comics became increasingly marketed more towards adults, who were also the ones with the money. Publishers were realizing, why have a business that is supported by lunch money and children's allowances when you can market more towards adults who will have a little bit more to spend on on their product. So you started seeing these new exclusive graphic novels appearing on in bookstores, not even in newsstands where comic books were previously sold, but in bookstores, in comic book shops, which really kind of emerged in the 1980s. Because I mean, a couple comic book shops popped up in the 70s in bigger cities like New York, LA, places like that. But in the 80s, that's when you really started seeing this boom in comic book shops. And these graphic novels were being sold in these comic book shops. And they were marketed towards adults. And these books were garnered quite a high price. If a comic book was 50 cents or 70 cents in the 1980s, these graphic novels were going for $4 or $5, which was a lot more than most children could afford back then. So out go a lot of children, in come a whole wave of new adults. And with these new adults in the market, they were wanting to now find back issues from the 60s, the 50s, 40s, whatever, that were informing the stories they were reading. Because as I mentioned earlier, Marvel and even DC had ongoing universes that were basically ongoing storylines from way back in the early years to all the way to that present day. Now here's where things go a little bit wonky. There are so many people now in the market who actually do like comic books that want to read these older stories and buy these older comics. But there isn't a huge supply of these comics from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And why? We mentioned that earlier as well too, because generally no one collected comics, no one kept them, there were no bags, no boards. Kids at the end of the day generally just threw out their comic books. And on top of it, in the 1930s, you had World War II paper drives where people could donate paper to the war effort. And that made Golden Age comics even more rare. So with so few classic comics and so many people wanting to read and own these classic comics, the prices of these classic comics skyrocketed. And that's kind of a nice segue into our next point, which was comic book speculation. So with these prices skyrocketing and these people now buying these comics for such high prices, that started getting media attention. And with now when the media is reporting on somebody who, hey, bought this comic book in the 1930s, Action Comics #1, and then sold it for thousands, well, then in media, they ate that all up. And people started paying attention to comic books because they were thinking, okay, comic books, like these comic books from like 30, 40 years ago are making people a lot of money. I want a piece of that pie. With these comics selling for such high prices, obviously not everyone had the funds to afford to buy a lot of these classic comics that are even sought after today. So what they started doing was they started buying comic books that were published in the 90s that they thought would look like they would be worth a lot of money in the future. People in the 90s were buying newly published comics that possibly contained the first appearance of a new character, the death of a new character. They bought the first issue of a comic book title that might eventually blow up and take off and become immensely popular. Anything that they thought would make them a lot of money in the future, they were buying. So it was only a matter of time before comic book publishers started catching on to this trend, and they started taking advantage of people's greed. New titles started appearing everywhere. New characters started appearing everywhere. Characters were dying. Characters were having their backs broken. Special edition covers were being released. And we're not just talking one variant cover. We're talking 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variant covers for one particular title. Chrome covers. There was just so much that publishers were trying to do to tap into the speculator consciousness in the 1990s. And people ate it all up. Nobody realized that what they were doing, everyone else was doing too. So when a particular comic that they thought was going to be worth a lot of money was released, they would buy 3, 4 copies of just that one issue because they thought they would be able to sell them later for high money and put their kids through college or retire early or just be plain rich. It got to the point where publishers didn't even care about the content of their comics and the quality of the art and the stories that they were producing. They were just worried about selling comics. And that is why generally a lot of the comic books from the 1990s are considered crap. So that kind of brings us to our next point, which is the rise of the rock star artist. Before the 1980s, the idea of the rock star artist never really existed. I mean, there was one artist from the 1960s that was often considered to be the first rock star artist, and that was Jim Steranko, who worked on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. for many years. But, I mean, the whole idea of the rock star artist really came to prominence in the 1980s. And who are these rock star artists? We're talking Todd McFarlane, we're talking Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Whilce Portacio, just so many artists that people just loved it. They loved their art, and they were basically buying anything that they were doing. These rock star artists back then really knew how valuable they were to these comic book companies, because the same way that people were buying up special edition covers and first appearances and death issues, so on and so forth, they were buying every single issue that their particular favorite artist was doing. For example, if you like Todd McFarlane, you were buying everything that Todd McFarlane was doing. So knowing this, these rockstar artists wanted greater creative freedom, and they also wanted a percentage of the ownership of any character that they create that may eventually make it big. You see, because before the rise of the direct market and Image Comics and all that, characters that were created by creators were not owned by those creators. They were paid their salary for creating the character. It was actually the corporation, Marvel or DC, that owned these huge characters and reaped all the benefits. That's what happened with Superman, for example. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they created Superman, but they did not own the rights to that character. DC did. So when Superman took off and became huge, DC became rich. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster certainly did not, because they were paid their salary for writing Action Comics #1. Same thing that happened with a character like, for example, with like Wolverine. Wolverine is another character that became huge, but he didn't make, and to this day he still doesn't make any, and that's Marv Wolfman, by the way, doesn't get any profit from the character of Wolverine, because he was paid his salary for writing Hulk 181 back in 1975. So these rockstar artists were looking for ownership because they wanted money, rightly so, for characters that they were creating. Well, this especially happened with Marvel. They couldn't come to an agreement with Marvel on character ownership and creative ownership, so all these rockstar artists left, and they started their own company, which is Image Comics. And Image Comics was a huge player in the 1990s and was really giving Marvel and DC a run for their money. So now that brings us to the rise of the direct market. What exactly is the direct market? Well, before the rise of the direct market, there was a system of comic book distribution in which a comic book wholesaler would sell comic books to let's say, a newsstand or a grocery store or a drugstore. And the newsstands and the stores that were selling the comic books would sell their issues, but whatever issues of that particular comic that they didn't sell, they were able to return to the wholesalers for credit. The direct market actually eliminated that whole system. What the direct market was these shops. It was mostly comic shops that were utilizing the direct market. These comic shops were basically guessing how many issues or how many copies of a particular issue they would need, and they would order that many. The retailer would send it to the comic book shop, and whatever copies that a comic book shop would not sell. They were stuck with. They would have to keep them. They were not able to return them for full credit. This was better for the distributors, and it was also better for the comic book publishers themselves, because they weren't having to allocate any credits for anything. So now you have rockstar artists, a direct market, and speculators buying up everything that Image is putting out, because they never know if any of these new Image characters are going to be huge in the future and yield them a lot of money. And they're buying up everything that Marvel's putting out and everything that DC's putting out, and these gimmicks and everything. Then, fast forward a little bit, maybe a year, 2 years later, and now they're trying to get rid of these, and they're trying to sell them to make a profit. And then what they're finding is, lo and behold, they can't sell any of them, because everybody else was doing the same thing they were. No one's going to pay a lot of money for something that's all over the place. Those Golden Age books, however, were very scarce, and they were very rare, and that's why everyone was paying so much money for them. But with these new books that they're now trying to sell, the print runs were so huge, and printers and publishers printed so many of these books that they were everywhere. Once people saw that they were not able to sell their books for high prices or even at all, they left the hobby. And with people not buying comic books and these print runs so huge from people buying up so many books in the past, the industry got hit really, really hard. And as you can recall from our discussion of the direct market, these comic book shops weren't even able to return the issues they weren't selling. So they had stacks and stacks and stacks of all these comics, and no one was buying them. So with so many people leaving the hobby all at once, comic book shops were closing everywhere, and the publishers themselves suffered immensely, to the point where Marvel Comics themselves had to declare bankruptcy in 1997. See, DC was safe. DC Comics, they were a subsidiary of Time Warner, so the Warner Brothers were able to bail them out. But Marvel, they didn't have a parent company, so they essentially had to declare bankruptcy. So all the factors and everything that I've just kind of discussed here all kind of melded together to ultimately lead up to the comic book crash. Now, if there's something you feel that I've left out, or if there's something that you'd like to add to this explanation of how the comic book crash ultimately happened, please comment below, and let's start a discussion about it. What I'm going to do is we're going to do the countdown in part 2, in a part 2 video here. So I'll put the link in the description so you can go to the actual countdown. I didn't realize how long that this was going to be. So go down and click on the countdown for the top 10 90s comics. So just for now, this is Dante D signing off. Ciao.